The summer of 1889 baked the canyonlands until they shimmered like glass. Heat rolled off the rock walls in waves, the air thick and trembling. Vultures circled high overhead, riding invisible currents, their black wings sharp against the white-blue sky. The ground was nothing but dust and stone, cracked and dry as old parchment. At the bottom of one narrow gulch where shadows barely clung to the canyon wall, she lay. Dust streaked her dress, her lips split and dry, her skin blistered by the sun. Whoever left her there hadn't cared whether she lived through the day. Her wrists still bore the marks of rope, faint grooves etched into fragile skin. The sound of boots on stone came slow, steady, and sure. A lone drifter, tall and ragged, made his way along the canyon's edge. His hat was pulled low, his shirt stained with travel, and a canteen swung empty at his side. He hadn't meant to stumble across anyone out here. Most didn't survive this stretch of desert, but something in the stillness caught his eye. Something human against the unforgiving earth. He stopped, squinting against the sun. For a long moment he said nothing, just took in the sight of her half buried in dust and heat. Then he muttered low, almost to himself, "Damn, they left you for the buzzards." He dropped to one knee, brushing grit from her face with a calloused hand. Her eyelids fluttered weakly, a whisper breaking from her throat. No words, just the ghost of a plea. The drifter's jaw tightened. He glanced at the empty canteen at his side, then back to her. He didn't have enough water even for himself, but something in the way she clung to the edge of life, fragile and desperate, pulled him deeper than the desert ever could. He slid his arms beneath her, lifting her against his chest. She was light as dry wood, yet heavy with the weight of abandonment. Standing, he looked up at the long stretch of canyon rising ahead. The sun was already past its peak, the trail long and merciless. Still, he muttered under his breath as he started forward, dust swirling at his boots. "You'll not die here. Not like this. Not while I'm still breathing." And so, with the sky burning above and the canyon floor stretching endless, the drifter carried her into the desert heat, every step a battle against the sun. The canyon floor stretched like a furnace, every rock searing hot beneath the drifter's boots. He shifted her weight in his arms, her head lolling weakly against his shoulder. Each shallow breath she drew rattled in his ear, a reminder that time was slipping fast. His throat burned dry, every swallow scraping like sand. The canteen at his side was nothing more than dead weight. Still, he walked, boots crunching over stone, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for something, anything, that promised water or shade. Above them, the vultures circled closer. Their wings whispered against the sky, black dots dipping lower with each passing minute. He spat into the dust, muttering, "Not today, not for her." At last, a break in the canyon wall revealed a narrow cleft, its shadows pooling dark and cool. He ducked inside, easing her down onto a flat stretch of stone. Her eyelids cracked open, eyes glazed and far away, and she tried to speak. What came out was little more than a rasp. "Don't leave me." The words hit him harder than the sun ever could. He crouched beside her, brushing damp hair from her face. "Ain't leavin'," he said, low but firm. "Not a step." From the corner of his eye, he spotted what he'd prayed for, a trickle of water threading down the rock, a thin line of silver cutting through dust. He crossed the cave in 3 long strides, cupped his hands, and brought back what little he could. Tilting her chin gently, he let the drops touch her lips. She sighed, red, her cracked mouth opening just enough to take it in. Relief softened the tightness in his chest. He went back again, and again, each handful precious as gold. When at last her breathing steadied, he sat back on his heels. Outside, the canyon blazed on, but here in the cool of stone a small pocket of hope had formed. The drifter leaned against the wall, his body aching from the weight he'd carried, but his eyes stayed fixed on her. She wasn't safe yet, not by a long shot. Whoever had left her in the dust had meant for her to die, and men that cruel rarely stayed far from their work. He pulled his revolver from its holster, checking the cylinder by instinct. 6 rounds, 6 chances, if it came to that. With a low sigh, he settled back into the shadows, the girl breathing shallow but alive beside him, and the long desert night beginning to creep over the canyon. Night fell heavy over the canyon, and with it came a silence so complete it pressed against the ears. The desert cooled fast. What had been burning sun now turned to cutting chill. The drifter pulled his worn duster around the girl, tucking the leather close to keep the shivers from rattling her too hard. Her eyes opened briefly, reflecting the faint light of the moon. Why'd you stop for me?" she whispered, her voice no stronger than the wind moving across the sand. He stared at her a long moment before answering. "Because somebody should have." She blinked slowly, a tear slipping down the dust on her cheek, and then she drifted back into restless sleep. The drifter sat cross-legged by the cave's mouth, revolver resting across his knee. The canyon below stretched out like an ocean of black stone, broken only by silver ribbons where moonlight caught the riverbeds. Somewhere in that darkness, coyotes yipped, and farther off still, a horse whinnied, a sound that didn't belong to wild country. His jaw tightened. He knew that sound too well. Men were out there. He rose and stepped to the edge, scanning the open stretches below. A faint glow bobbed against the canyon floor. Lantern light. More than one. Moving slow, deliberate, hunting. He ducked back inside, heart beating steady and hard. They weren't leaving it to chance. Whoever had cast her into the dust hadn't expected a drifter to come along and carry her out, and now they were coming to finish what they started. He looked down at her sleeping face, pale even in the dim glow. He could leave, slip into the night, take his chances alone. But her soft words came back to him, the way she'd clung to life when he'd given her water. Not a chance. He slid the revolver back into its holster and began gathering what little he had. His knife, his bedroll, the scraps of jerky left in his saddlebag. Quiet, careful movements. Then he leaned down, scooped her into his arms once more, and carried her deeper into the canyon cleft. Behind him, the glow of the lanterns grew brighter, voices carrying faint through the night air. Men calling to each other, their words cruel and sharp as the stones underfoot. The drifter kept moving, every step steady, silent and sure. He wasn't running, he was choosing his ground. Because if those men wanted her life, they'd have to go through him first. The cave wound deeper than he'd first guessed, splitting into narrow cracks of stone where the air turned colder, damp with old water seeping through the rock. The drifter laid her gently against a sloping wall, covering her with his coat. He crouched beside her, studying the shallow rise and fall of her breath. Her lips moved, the faintest whisper. "Don't let them find me." He leaned close. "They won't. Not while I'm standing." She stirred, and in the half-dark her words spilled out in broken pieces. "They took everything. My father's land. Wouldn't sign. Wouldn't bend. So they..." Her voice trailed into silence. The drifter felt his jaw lock tight. He didn't need the full story to know the shape of it. Men with power and guns, driving folks off their land, leaving their bones to bleach in the desert when they refused. He'd seen it before, too many times. A sound outside pulled him back, a horse snorting close, hooves scattering loose stone. Voices followed. "She's out here somewhere. Ain't no way she walked off." Spread wide, light every crack. The drifter's hand found the worn grip of his revolver. He slid low to the cave mouth, eyes narrowing. The lanterns were closer now. 3, maybe 4 men moving in a line, the glow painting their faces in sharp strokes. Hard-eyed, cruel men, carrying rifles like they were born with them. He counted the shadows. 5. Too many to fight head-on, not with her unable to move. His gaze flicked back toward the sleeping girl. No, running wasn't an option. Not anymore. He took a slow breath, listening to the scrape of boots and the jangle of tack drifting through the canyon night. The men were sweeping wide, careless in their confidence. They thought she was already theirs. The drifter shifted deeper into the shadows, placing himself where the stone met darkness. His mind was already working. The canyon was narrow. every echo carrying, every lantern casting long shadows that could just as easy blind a man as guide him. They had numbers. He had silence, stone, and resolve. And sometimes, that was enough. He turned once more to the girl, murmuring low, "Stay quiet. I'll handle what comes." Then he moved like the canyon itself, slipping out into the dark, becoming part of the night that those men thought they owned. The desert night was alive with sound, if a man knew how to listen. The clink of a spur striking rock, the wheeze of a lantern flame as it swayed, the sharp whisper of leather reins pulled tight. The drifter crouched low behind a cluster of jagged stone, his revolver heavy but steady in his hand. The men fanned wider through the canyon, their lanterns throwing long, dancing shadows against the walls. One called out in a low, mocking drawl, "Girl ain't getting far. She's weak as a newborn foal. When we find her, I'm taking the first cut." Another chuckled, cruel and certain. The drifter's jaw flexed. He waited, measuring distance, watching how their lights broke the dark. The canyon had a rhythm, and he meant to make it his ally. The nearest man came within 10 yards, lantern swinging in one hand, rifle loose in the other. Too close, too careless. The drifter rose from the shadows in one smooth motion. His arm snapped forward. No shot, not yet. Instead, he hurled a fist-sized rock. It cracked against the canyon wall opposite, sending a burst of sound bouncing back in 100 echoes. The man spun. "Over there!" he shouted, rifle jerking toward the sound. The others turned too, lanterns swaying, chasing ghosts across the stone. That was the moment the drifter stepped behind him. A hand shot out, clamping his mouth shut, the revolver barrel pressed against his ribs. One muffled grunt, then silence. The man sagged into the dust, lanterns snuffed beneath him. 4 left. The drifter melted back into the dark, his boots silent on the gravel. The canyon was his now, and the men didn't yet realize it. From the cave behind him, he thought he heard her stir faintly. Maybe a whisper, maybe just breath, but it sharpened his resolve. One by one, he would draw them off. One by one, he would make sure they never laid eyes on her again. The leader's voice cut through the silence, harsher now. "Don't scatter too wide. He's out here. I can feel it." The drifter's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. He wasn't running anymore. He was hunting. The canyon seemed to breathe with him now, stone walls holding the echo of every footstep, every scrape of boot leather, every nervous exhale from the men who thought they were hunters. But the roles had shifted. The drifter waited in the dark until the second man edged too close to the sea, curve of rock. His lantern threw a thin slice of light across the sand, enough for the drifter to see the tremble in his hands. He wasn't ready for the night. He wasn't ready for the silence that followed. A swift movement, an arm across his throat, a shove into the dust. The man thrashed, lantern tumbling and shattering, glass hissing against the ground. A dull thud, then stillness. 3 left. The leader cursed under his breath, voice ragged. "He's picking us off. Spread wide. Don't let him corner you." But spreading wide was the mistake. The drifter slipped along the canyon wall, boots finding each foothold with care. The third man stood separated now, his lantern glowing faintly against the rock. The drifter drew his revolver and cocked the hammer. The sound was barely louder than a breath, but in the canyon it carried sharp as the crack of a whip. The man froze. He turned slow, lantern shaking. The last thing he saw was the gleam of steel in the dark. One shot, clean, final. The gunshot boomed through the canyon, rattling against the stone like thunder. The lantern fell, sputtered, and went out. 2 left. The leader barked orders, voice cracking with anger. "Close in. He ain't more than one man." But the canyon swallowed his words, turning them into ghosts that seemed to come from every direction. The girl stirred again in the cave. A weak murmur carried on the wind. The drifter's ears caught it, soft but alive. That was enough. Enough to keep his hand steady, his breath calm, his resolve hard as iron. The hunt wasn't over. The last two had lanterns still burning, their lights swaying through the dark like beacons, but the drifter knew lanterns worked both ways. They showed the ground for the men who carried them, and they showed everything else for the man who hunted. The canyon air tightened, as if even the night was waiting for what came next. Two lights bobbed in the dark, their lanterns swaying, throwing nervous shadows across the stone. Every time they raised them higher, the glow betrayed their faces, pale with fear. Every time they lowered them, the dark pressed closer, heavy and suffocating. The drifter stayed low against the wall, eyes fixed on their movements. He could see the leader now, a man with a scar across his cheek, jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to snap. He wasn't afraid in the way the others were. No, his fear was quieter, a fear that masked itself with pride, the kind that drove men to keep pushing even when they knew the ground beneath them was giving way. The drifter studied him the way a wolf studies a bull elk, patient, measuring, waiting for the stumble. The other man, one of the hired guns, was already stumbling. His lantern arm shook, his revolver jerking at every gust of wind. He muttered under his breath, curses that sounded more like prayers. The drifter didn't give him a chance to finish. A stone slid beneath the drifter's boot as he shifted position, just enough sound to draw the man's lantern toward him, and in that second, the drifter rose from the dark, revolver steady. One shot. The hired gun crumpled, lantern bursting in the sand. Sparks spit, then died. His curse turned to silence. Only one light remained, the leader's. The canyon felt emptier now, wider, like the walls themselves were pulling back to watch. The leader's lantern cast his shadow high and sharp against the rock, a towering spectre that made him look bigger than he was. But the drifter knew size meant nothing in the dark. The girl stirred again in the cave, her voice a faint whisper. "Don't leave me." The drifter's jaw tightened. He stepped out from behind the wall. No more shadows, no more waiting. His boots crunched the sand loud enough for the leader to hear. The lantern swung toward him, and the two men faced each other across the cold canyon floor. One light between them, one breath from the end. The canyon went still as a church before a prayer. Only the hiss of the lantern flame broke the silence. The leader's eyes burned with a fury that came less from courage and more from shame. Shame that a girl he'd left for dead was still breathing. Shame that a lone drifter had stood against him and his men. "You should have kept walking," he said, his voice low, echoing off the stone. "She ain't worth it." The drifter didn't flinch. His revolver was already leveled, his stance steady as if he'd been standing there all his life. "She's worth more than you'll ever know." The leader sneered, hand hovering near his own holster. "Then you'll die for her." The canyon seemed to lean closer, listening. Somewhere in the dark, an owl cried once, then fell silent. The drifter's hand didn't move. Not yet. He watched the twitch in the leader's fingers, the subtle shift of his boots digging for balance in the sand. It was always the same with men like him. They moved too soon. Pride was quicker than patience. And just like that, pride betrayed him. The leader's hand darted down, leather squealing as he drew. But the drifter was already there. One thunderclap cracked through the canyon, the revolver's flame burning the dark for a single heartbeat. When the echo faded, the leader was on his knees, lantern dropped into the sand, its light spilling sideways. His breath rattled, his eyes wide as though he'd finally seen himself for what he was, small, weak, undone. He toppled face first into the dust. The drifter didn't move for a long while. He just stood there, revolver smoking, listening as the canyon returned to silence. Then, slowly, he holstered the gun, turned his back on the body, and walked toward the cave. The girl's eyes found him as he knelt beside her, her lips trembling. "It's over? It's over," he said, his voice softer now, worn but steady. "You're safe." Morning came slow, pouring gold down the canyon walls, painting the stone in colors softer than the night before. The desert wind had shifted too, gentler now, no longer carrying the weight of menace, but the promise of another day. The girl leaned against the drifter's arm as they stepped out of the cave, Her steps were small, unsteady, but she was walking, alive. The sun caught the dust in her hair, turning it to threads of fire. Behind them, the canyon kept its silence. No sound of pursuit, no shadow of men on horseback. Just the vast, hollow country, open and waiting. The drifter paused at the ridge and looked back one last time. He didn't speak. Men like him rarely did when words weren't needed. But his jaw tightened, his eyes carrying the weight of all that had been buried in those canyon shadows. She noticed, her voice small. "You could have left me." "Could have," he said. His tone was flat but not unkind. "But I didn't." The girl drew a breath, the desert air filling her lungs, tasting of sage and dust instead of fear. She let it out slow, as though learning what freedom felt like. They started walking again, the long stretch of desert opening before them. Two figures against the vastness, one carrying his silence, the other carrying her second chance. The sun climbed higher, and their shadows stretched long across the sand, side by side. And though the desert was wide and merciless, for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt alone. The lantern's light flickered against the stone, and for the first time in that long night, the dark didn't feel so heavy.